Hey folks, it's House of GNAT-TV, and today we're in Wells, Vermont, and I'm talking with Cathy Walker. And Cathy, you have a wonderful skill, can I call it that?
Sure.
And what is it?
I'm an astrologer. For about 35 years, I've been fascinated with astrology, and I've spent time understanding the stars and trying to translate for people so that they can use that information to help themselves.
Gotcha. And she's going to tell us a story today. And what's the story?
It's just a brief history of astrology.
Gotcha.
Just to take a look at how astrology is different from astronomy and how that came to be.
Got it. Here we go. I'm going to get out of the way and we're going to let Cathy take it over.
I'd like to tell you a story, so please get comfy. Take off your shoes and settle in. Feel your feet on the floor and just take a deep, long breath and let it go with a long exhale. Take another one. And I'd like to ask you to remember a night sky, one of your favorite night skies. Call it to mind. Close your eyes if you'd like. And remember how you felt. What did you see? And let those feelings linger. I'm going to ask you to imagine how our ancient ancestors must have felt when they looked at the night sky. We understand the science of the stars, but can you imagine how much awe, how much wonder they experienced when they saw all of the sky phenomena? Not just the stars and the sun and the moon, but thunder and lightning, the sunrise and the sunset, meteorites, eclipses. Our ancestors were very keen observers of the natural world around them. They had to be. There was no grocery stores, there was no doctors. They depended on their senses for survival. And they looked for what was stable and predictable among the tumult and the chaos, seemingly chaos of the natural world. They observed the cycles of sky and of earth, and this became a way of life for them. They learned about the weather. They learned about spring and fall and summer and winter. And this eventually helped them learn when to hunt and when to gather, when to migrate, and eventually they learned when to sow crops. It was the foundation of civilization. The cycles of light and dark were, and still are, the irrefutable rhythm to which all life on this planet is attuned to. All the plants, all the animals, including us human animals, respond to day and night, to spring and fall. We call it the circadian rhythm, but our very distant ancestors called it divine. They called it holy mystery. They wanted to interact with this more. So eventually they built places where they could worship, or where they could touch or reach or align with these rhythms of light and dark. They built Stonehenge. They built the pyramids of Egypt, the pyramids down in Mexico. There's a great medicine wheel in Wyoming. There's even a stone chamber in South Woodstock that is aligned, its doorway is aligned, there's a lintel there that aligns with the winter solstice sunrise. Now it's on private land and it was built. It's believed it was built by the early Viking explorers. It's fascinating. These monuments were very important to our ancient relatives. They were places of worship and divine intersection, yes, but they are also, by today's standards, astronomical calendars that mark the sunrise and sunsets on particular days. It marked the cycles of the sun and the moon, and some of them even mark the cycles of Venus and Mars. In the beginning, astrology and astronomy were the same science. The movement of the stars had meaning, and that body of knowledge was accumulated over millennia of observations. To our ancient ancestors, this was the voice of the divine. It was the will of the Creator. Hence, astrology is considered a form of divination. Now, how this information was used depended greatly on the culture using it. For instance, the Greeks viewed the astrological chart as something of a predestinate fate. The Romans also viewed it as a fate, but they interjected some sort of intercession so that you could go and have your chart read by the priests in the temple. And if your fate was to die penniless in a foreign land, not a good ending, they would say, well, maybe we can intercede. If we'll sacrifice a couple of goats and maybe you'll die penniless in your own house. Every culture interjected or flavored their interpretations based on their worldview. Since astrology and astronomy was considered the voice of the gods, it was practiced by the priests and priestesses all over the globe, and it was reserved for the kings and queens and the ruling class. To their credit, the Greeks democratized astrology, and you could go to a temple and have your birth chart interpreted for you in Greece. The Greeks considered it a science along with math and geometry. In fact, it was so highly regarded that all the major universities of Europe had departments dedicated to teaching this astronomy into the 1700s. Our Western astrology traces its line back to the Greeks, who borrowed from the Egyptians, who took from the Babylonians and the Sumerians. There was a great melting pot that happened during Hellenistic times under the empire created by Alexander the Great. The Mediterranean cultures, the Persians, Hindu-Indian cultures, and the Arabs all blended their knowledge of the skies and science together. And that was really the root of the Western astrology that we study today. There are other schools of astrology that also derive from that melting pot. Jyotish astrology, that is practiced in India, is one of them. And we all know the famous Chinese astrology. The Native Americans had their own systems of astrology, but our Western astrology came from these wonderful, rich cultures from which we get much of our civilization. Astrology was alive and well 2,000 years ago in the Mediterranean. And in the early Christian church, it was considered not a big deal. Everybody was attuned to the sky and to the stars. In fact, it was somewhat supported, but it was officially banned by the Catholic Church, as was all forms of divination, after the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. But people still continued to consult the stars during the Dark Ages and medieval times. During the Renaissance, astrology bloomed again, but interesting, it was the scientists of the day who practiced the art. Many of them had other specialties, and they used their astrological readings and knowledge to fund their scholarly activities. The kings and queens of that time hired many of the bright lights of those centuries to guide them, to interpret for them the movement and the meaning of the stars. Johannes Kepler is a fine example of that. Kepler was considered one of the fathers of modern astrology. He wrote a book on planetary motion that was one of the founding stones that Galileo used for his theory of gravity. Now, Kepler was a wonderful mathematician and rose up through as a college professor, then became a court mathematician, and then he had the opportunity to go study in Prague with an astrologer called Tycho Brahe, who was considered the leading astrologer/astronomer of the day. Kepler, after years of combining both his mathematics and his astronomy, wrote in a letter to a friend, "I find a most unfailing experience the excitement of the sublunary, i.e. human nature, caused by the conjunctions and the aspects of the planets, has instructed and compelled my unwilling belief." This was a man of science who found meaning, consistent, documentable meaning, and influenced by the planetary motions. Later in his life, after a long and glorious career, he accepted a position as a court astronomer. In the late 1700s, astrology was discredited by the arising scientific knowledge. Probably the final nail in the coffin was Copernicus's proof that the Earth was not at the center of the solar system, but in fact the sun was. But people never stopped paying attention to the stars. It just went underground. In the late 1800s, the spiritualist movement in England gave rise to it, a new curiosity about it. And in the early 1900s, Carl Jung married his knowledge of psychology and the archetypal field with astrological knowledge. He felt that the archetypes spoke through astrology. That was the birth of psychological astrology, and that is most commonly practiced today. That's the kind of astrology I practice, using it as a tool to help people understand themselves so that they can make better choices and create lives that are satisfying and really thrive. So whether you embrace astrology or not, the night sky still speaks to us. It's just as lyrical now as it was 10,000 years ago. So I invite you to go outside, to look up, and to listen to the language of the stars.